For more than 3 decades, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has been one of the most consequential and controversial figures on the High Court. And in a new book, Republican Senator Ted Cruz is drawing on his own Supreme Court clerkship, his longtime friendship, and hours of interviews to offer a personal portrait of Thomas and the experiences that shaped his views of the Constitution. In Going Further, the incomparable Clarence Thomas, Cruz traces Thomas's journey from poverty in Georgia to the nation's highest court and makes the case for his impact on American law. Joining us now, MS Now senior Capitol Hill reporter and host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale. He joined you, Ali, to talk about his book, but that's not all you discussed. Tell us about it.
Definitely not all we discussed, Mika, though we did talk about some of the impactful decisions that Thomas has made on the Supreme Court, things like the Dobbs decision, and now the ways that this current DOJ in some ways is trying to make it permanent, to carry the words of the Attorney General Todd Blanche. That's something that Cruz, interestingly, told me was outside of the purview of DOJ. You can read that part of our interview on ms.now. It's the full is also on YouTube. But I thought it was fascinating to talk to Cruz, not just about where his focus is in this book, but where his focus might be in the future. Of course, thinking about not just these midterms where he has made endorsements in races where sometimes his endorsed candidate beat Trump's endorsed candidate, but then also what it means for someone who is set to travel to Iowa, for example, in the coming days. And if he thinks that this 2028 Republican field is settled behind J.D. Vance, for example. Listen to that exchange that I had with Senator Ted Cruz.
Look, I think going forward, we're in the midst of a debate about who our party is and what we believe. And I think economically, we've got a debate. Are we a small government, free market conservative party? Or are we a big government nanny state party?
Is this a party that has coalesced already behind J.D. Vance?
Oh, no. There's going to be a full discussion about who we are and what we believe. Listen.
Are you going to be part of that?
There'll be time to figure that out. I'll certainly be part of the discussion because I care deeply about economically. I think we should be a conservative party. And on foreign policy, we've got to debate. Are we an isolationist party that withdraws from the world? Or do we believe in American leadership? And I care deeply about both of those issues and who the party is.
So he is drawing the fault lines right there, Willie. I mean, he's saying that'll be a discussion for another time, but how quickly he said to me that the party, oh no, not settled behind J.D. Vance. This is someone who, of course, ran for president in 2016, has had one heck of an arc when it comes to President Donald Trump. He went from the last bulwark, as Lamir and I were talking about on Way Too Early, against Trump ascending to the GOP nomination in 2016, only to now in this latest interview talking about Trump as talking about being one of Trump's closest allies in the Senate and saying that he talks to the president all the time. It was interesting. At one point, he said he does good things and he does bad things. I like it better when he does the good. I mean, the distinctions are starting to be there as the party turns the page post-Trump. And I'm interested in the role that someone like Cruz could play in that.
And fascinating that answer, if you listen closely, there was implicit critique of the Trump administration, which is this isolationism. We're turning our back on our allies. We're attacking our allies and courting these dictators around the world, pulling away from Ukraine, for example. And then on the economic question, he asked, are we going to be a conservative economic party? Well, $40 trillion in debt, high inflation, tariffs, none of those things fall over what any of us would have defined as a conservative ideology in terms of the economy. So it's interesting, too, in your interview, just talking about his relationship with Donald Trump. Says he talks to him once a week or maybe every day. And he said he listens to me. Not always, but he listens to me. How does he view that relationship?
There were a few fascinating things, even in relation to the court, right? I asked Cruz at one point, you're writing about a Supreme Court justice. Do you want to be on the Supreme Court? And he said no. And in fact, this wasn't a hypothetical for him during Trump's first term. He said that Trump came to him at each of the 3 vacancies and asked him seriously, do you want to be on the court? And at each point, Cruz said no, because he wants to play a game of active politics. And you can't do that from the bench. But on tariffs, too, he made the point that he is someone. There's 2 camps, he said, in the Trump administration, people who view tariffs as leverage and people who view tariffs as permanent policy. He put himself in the first camp, saying that tariffs should be leverage, but urging people within the administration on Canada, for example, to take yes for a deal when that point comes.
Yeah, there were a few moments where he tried to create a little daylight. As we talked about last hour, he was about his slate of endorsements, and you asked him if they needed to be MAGA candidates, and his response was, So,
I
mean, literally, that's what he did. And then we saw again here where he created a little bit of space. So, David Drucker, let's talk about this a little bit. It's two tracks here. First of all, we are seeing small, again, let's emphasize, small signs of the Republican Party starting to look beyond Donald Trump. You know, that in a couple of years he will, we think, come off stage. So there's that. But also, let's think about that conversation with the idea of, okay, well, who's going to be next? Sure, Vice President Vance would be the favorite, but we know there's Marco Rubio talk. Well, there's probably a couple Republican governors looking at it, and I think we'd have to include the man once known as Lion Ted, who has turned himself into a Trump acolyte. He might be thinking about it, too.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see who wants to challenge Vice President Vance when he's very likely to have Trump's endorsement and the Trump machine behind him. Not to mention his own machine, which he has been building for the past couple of years. That's going to be formidable. And I think a lot of Republicans are going to look at what happened in 2024. I've talked to a lot of Republican insiders about this, and they're going to determine that the juice isn't worth the squeeze, particularly if the environment looks like it's more favorable to a Democrat. But I do think Ted Cruz is interesting in this regard, at least initially, is that he is one of the first prominent Republicans we have seen openly challenge certain elements of the Republican coalition that has grown around President Trump, most notably in his very direct, specific criticism of Tucker Carlson and people of his ilk. Many Republicans will do this euphemistically, but they won't name Tucker by name. Senator Cruz continues to do that. And he's just very open about the divisions within the party, right? And when Ted Cruz ran for president the first time in 2016, his view of the party at the time was the exact same place that the party was. And now it's a very open question, and it's a debate in many ways that he's initiating. It'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Bloomberg's David Drucker, thank you so much for coming on this morning. And MS Now senior Capitol Hill reporter and host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale, thank you as well.